It may seem odd to say that we're living in the Jordan Peterson era. Most people would say that ended 2, 3, 4 years ago when he came out of rehab. We were all interested to see which Jordan Peterson would emerge, and it ended up being a more mainstream Jordan Peterson, someone who fraternised with the Russell Brands and Dave Rubins of the world. Second to that, he lost a lot of his core audience, his more edgy audience, because he became increasingly political. Of course, that will make someone immediately divisive, and he became quite irascible with it. He's put forth this sort of 60s to 90s style libertarianism as a solution to wokeism. That gets him lots of critics on the right. They see him as a sort of Zionist boomer who's offering old solutions to very new problems. So while Jordan Peterson has joined Conservative Inc., now he's an employee of Ben Shapiro, it's easy to forget how massive his impact was about 10 years ago. It seems to me, for better or worse, we may now actually be living in a Petersonian world, at least on the right, and with the growth of people like Donald Trump. As I say, this process started about 10 years ago, circa 2015, when Jordan Peterson really exploded. I was in London at that time, and I knew lots of leftist liberal men. Now, of course, they're leftist liberal by definition. That's what the culture demands, so whether they believe it or not is another matter. But I saw them almost overnight take on Jordan Peterson's opinions after watching his biblical lectures. I think the reason for this is he bucked the trend of the stuffy old bully tyrannical conservative that young men had been bombarded with since birth. He also spoke to a lost generation of men, a generation that had been told since school that masculinity is bad, that to be a good man is to be a feminine man, soft and tolerant. I think while such men were being demonised by the Guardianistas of this world as toxic and evil, Peterson picked up that they were wounded and traumatised and thought they'd be better off playing computer games and watching porn than engaging in the real world and with real women. In essence, he became a father figure to a generation that didn't have father figures, whether that's because of divorce or abandonment, whether it's because their fathers had been feminised by liberalism, or even because they dived into Thatcherism and just weren't at home, more obsessed with chasing money. Now, this immediately made him an absolute enemy of the liberal leftist worldview, a demon even, but they didn't really know how to deal with him. They couldn't call him the typical bully conservative because he was more of a radical liberal than that, and they couldn't exactly call him a fascist either because he kept breaking down into tears over libertarianism and the state of men. Now, the left have figured out their line on him at this point, that he's a fragile, drug-addled proto-fascist selling self-help snake oil. However, it took the leftists too long to get to that line, and by that point too many normies had been won over to Jordan Peterson's line, especially by the tears. Personally, I think he cries a bit too much, but when you first do see him break down and cry over the state of young men, it can be very moving to people who feel like nobody's ever cared about them. Now, I too felt this very keenly. As I've said before, I lost a close family member to suicide, and I've known 2 other men, young men in my life, that also committed suicide, and that's a sad story that you find across the modern UK, across the Western world today, in any walk of life. So in essence, there were real problems in the Western world, and the left was offering oversimplified and ideological explanations such as toxic masculinity for such phenomena. However, Jordan Peterson quite masterfully outmaneuvered all this ideology with much deeper structural and cultural explanations as to what was going on. It is worth saying here that Jordan Peterson wasn't necessarily saying anything new. He was more reawakening fundamental truths of the Western tradition. He's an excellent speaker with an expansive mind, which obviously helps. But he could relay that information in a way that was moving and original and inspiring, and it made him a sort of demigod figure amongst young men and some elements of the right wing. Yet if we do break down what he's saying, you can see there are immediate precedents. For instance, he struck at the very core, the apex of the woke era, which gave his message especially important impact. However, his warnings about Marxism and teachings that many left-wing radicals have something wrong with themselves has been said by many people before. In fact, a few years before Jordan Peterson, I remember Peter Hitchens talking about that after he read Arthur Koestler. That's why I've said before, as crazy as it sounds, that Peter Hitchens was something of a Jordan Peterson, because he was explaining the impact of the left-wing ideology on the culture before many people. Similarly, Peterson was very famous for his sort of mytho-poetic visions, his reading of the cultural texts of the era. However, and this isn't a criticism of Peterson, but it was fundamentally just Jungianism rehashed for a new era. He was playing on the archetypes and combining them with a sort of evolutionary driver. If you read someone like Joseph Campbell, for instance, you'll find he speaks in a very similar vein to Peterson, has very similar views. You could argue that Joseph Campbell is the spiritual brother to Jordan Peterson's intellectualism. They're both sons of Jung, though, fundamentally. Peterson's intellectualism was also the key factor in probably the most important role he's played in the Western world, which is reawakening the Western Christian tradition. You may have noted that many people who were drawn to Peterson and his Christian message weren't religious. They weren't people even who were spiritually sympathetic. And the person who reawakened Christianity in the Western world wasn't a bishop. It wasn't a Christian. It wasn't even an Eckhart Tolle spiritualist. It was essentially someone arguing for Christianity from more atheistic positions. Naturally, why Peterson was so successful was because he came on the back of the New Atheists, and the New Atheists did a very good job at completely dismantling any arguments for a spiritual dimension of life. And Peterson didn't argue from a spiritual position, he argued from an intellectual and materialist mind-based position, which was much more accessible for the modern mind, who completely discount any dimension of the spirit. They see that as airy-fairy, nonsensical. Now, the problem with this, from a Christian or a traditionalist perspective, is that Peterson isn't really making a spiritual Christian or traditionalist argument fundamentally. It might seem like he is, but he's not really. He's essentially making an argument for evolution, for optimal social outcomes as God, quote unquote. That's not a religious or spiritual position, which would be something like you let the pride of your intellect die before the wisdom of the spirit. Your ego melts, if you like, into a broader wisdom which created everything around us and is the true source, the authorship of life. Of course, that language is too strong for a modern. It's too wacky, it's off-putting. However, if you speak about it symbolically, it's much more accessible. If you align it with evolution, it's much more understandable. And that's also where Peterson had a huge impact on the culture. He spoke about many of the evolutionary truths between men and women that you'll find in the red pill area of things. For those who don't know, the red pill was a major movement in the last decade teaching men about how women really work. Many men have been told, just be a nice guy, be like a woman, try and be sweet, bring her flowers. And they don't realise why women don't date them. They think, why am I striking out? Well, the red pill essentially told men about harsh evolutionary truths, that women like men, they like masculine energy. Doesn't mean they're like bullies, but it means they're like people who are capable of being strong, who can amass resources, who have social confidence, etc., etc. And Jordan Peterson in many ways riffed on this too, promoting a more stronger form of masculinity that men could grow into. Now, while it's fair to state that Jordan Peterson may have peaked a few years ago, I think it's fair to say that after Peterson, in the post-Peterson era, he gave birth to many different strands that we're seeing in the Western world now. Obviously, there's been the turn back to Christianity. I think Jordan Peterson has been huge in that. I also think there's the post-red pill movements of men understanding what women really want. That could be seen as a turn back to traditional values in relationships. There's more and more interest in that these days. Then politically, I think he's opened up a space for a more intellectual argument for the right, which has historically been seen as stupid by the left. They think the right is unintellectual. You could argue that it is, or it was at least in some instances. It was more economically based or theologically based, not intellectually based, but Peterson has given it a sort of intellectual foundation. That's attracted many of the Musk figures, the Joe Rogans, the Russell Brands and so on, and in many ways you could say has opened the door for a new era of Trumpianism. Yet there's also been a split here in that you'll see in the online right, the hard right, the radical right, many of the young people that have been drawn to that will actually say online that I started with Jordan Peterson. I was a leftist, I found Peterson, and now I've moved on to more radical ideas on the right wing. And I'm sure Peterson wouldn't like that, because many on the radical right argue that Peterson is a sort of gatekeeper. And he's really trying to do what Trump is ultimately trying to do, which is bring back this 60s to 90s style colourblind MLK ideology of what the Western world is. It's actually what Reform are trying to do here as well. You can see this in this clip.
Well, Reform is very, very clear about this. It's in our contract with the people that, speaking of President Trump, during his inaugural speech, he just, obviously a few days ago, he said, he invoked the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and said America will once again be a country that is colourblind and merit-based. That is exactly the sort of country that we will have in the United Kingdom under a reform government. The reality is, and I say this as obviously as someone who is an ethnic minority, has worked in some large American companies that have DEI programs, it doesn't do anybody any good. The reality is that as soon as you either judge people based on immutable characteristics or you judge people on merit. You either say you want equality of outcome or equality of opportunity. You cannot have both. A reform government will invoke that spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and say, listen, people should be judged on the content of their character and their merit and absolutely not on the colour of their skin.
Could I just say very quickly, in the last election...
That is, of course, Zia Youssef, the chairman of Reform. And I think that what we can see at the root of these ideas is that the Jordan Peterson worldview that he's expressed, and even though it's grown way beyond him now, has been taken on by the mainstream. Now, some people may well argue that the mainstream has done that because it could see that wokeism was losing too many people and they need a new model, if you like, for the globalist capitalist money power to continue. And many may see it as just a return to sense because wokeism was just getting absolutely wacky, wasn't it? I mean, let's be honest, the transgender kids nonsense. I think even the average person who's left-leaning was thinking, okay, this is just getting weird now. Yeah, the ultimate point I'm getting to in this video is that I think now we're seeing Petersonism really peak, or its impact really peak in the Western world. And that means that it's appealing to the normies now. It's not so much the change makers, the actual thinkers that do lead to a new tomorrow. And that means that these ideas of 90s libertarianism are probably going to get overinflated and eventually pop. So what comes next? As regular viewers know, I don't think the 60s to 90s libertarianism can truly last forever in this sort of liberal utopian way. That's because, again, economic inequality is too great, the process of globalization is too far advanced. That also means the demographics of countries are fundamentally changing, meaning that libertarianism it won't be the same. You know, the underlying structures which made it possible are different. And on top of that, despite Jordan Peterson, if you like, leading to an enhancement in interest in Christianity, there is still a massive decline of our tradition. That is broadly unavoidable. To my mind, this means only two paths are possible in the future. We either continue with the economic and social liberalism. Of course, we all know that's going to lead to total collapse. Eventually, we will see complete atomization. And after that, we will either be batteries for a globalist system or a new power structure will take charge. Be that China, a Chino-Russo alliance, Islam, whatever it may well be, whatever's strongest at the time. Or alternatively, Westerners take that extra step that Peterson couldn't or wouldn't, and that's the true step into the tradition, the true step into the spirit. Of course, that's almost impossible for many modern people. But for some, their souls are awakening, their hearts are coming alive, they're realizing the materialism of modernity is going to destroy them. It is going to destroy the West. There's no getting away from that. The liberals will tell you it's going to be a utopia forever. That's not going to happen. But if you look at through the cold hard light of day, it's essentially unavoidable. So it seems to me then the only viable path is the step back into the tradition and everything that entails. That's almost the post-Petersonian path, you could call it. And that is, of course, very much my mission on the Substack, which begins with our own individual spiritual revolution, working on ourselves and so on. There's got a lot of content on that coming down the line, so do check that out. It's linked in the description. And there are many other people speaking about these themes, which I intend to interview in the near future. I don't think we're alone on that journey. So do consider subscribing to the Substack if you're interested, and let me know your thoughts about this down below. And consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.